Roll call.
Cardwell,
Yes.
Adams. Here. Durden.
Here.
Kelly.
Here.
Eaton.
Here.
Ronnie. Here. Butcher.
Here.
Thank you. So tonight, we have an interesting variety of projects to discuss. We have a few odds and ends to take care of, and then we're going to talk about some zoning changes. So first, Councilperson Terry Durbin would like to make an announcement about office hours.
Yeah. So I think we've changed the name from office hours to chat with the city council person. So we want to get that started up, and we're going to, Pete and I have been working because we seem to be the two that can be there regularly. So we thought we'd do it after the CC regular session, the Thursday following the Tuesday. And we're going to, the first one will be the kickoff on Thursday, April 14th. Then we're going to try to be available for the people, whether it's a morning or afternoon. So we'll be at the Cattail Bakery at 9 a.m. on that Thursday. And then one of us will be at the fireplace at the Pollard at 5. So we figured that way you can come in and chat. The other council people have expressed some interest in coming in when their schedule permits. So at least some will be there for you to talk to. So that will be one time per month. We'll start it out and see what the interest is. And if a lot of people are interested, then we can always expand it to a couple times a month. So hopefully that works for everybody.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing we're going to do is I need to address something about water bills, property water bills. The City of Red Lodge has an ordinance, 1-3-3, that states a person requesting to establish an account for city water and or wastewater service must be the owner of the property to be served. This ordinance was enacted in 1998 and was never really enforced. Because of all the different arrangements people have with their properties regarding who should pay the bills, it has created a lot of difficulties in getting water bills addressed and who should pay them. To clear it all up, the city is going to start enforcing the water bill provision that all water bills must be in the name of the property owners beginning in May. For any property that is managed by a property management company, billing can continue to be in their care. If you have any questions, our clerk's office is very friendly and will happily answer any of your questions. But please make arrangements to ensure that property owners do have those accounts in their names. The third thing coming up tonight is a city-owned land permit for the farmer's market. We'll get to that, but you're all probably familiar with that process. Tonight is just a discussion to find out if there's any peculiar things about it. We will also be discussing and voting on a few resolutions that the Community Foundation has requested, which will enable them to be eligible for some funds for a housing study. And then the final and biggest thing we're going to discuss is changes to our zoning ordinances. Every 5 years, the city reviews our zoning ordinances. Our planning commission, that would be Courtney, has that's wrong. There's a whole commission, it's not Courtney. Has spent more than a year picking through each of the provisions to keep them up to date, most notably working to address provisions affecting housing. We will go through each of the recommended changes and discuss if we are in overall agreement with the Planning Commission or if we think further changes or no changes need to be made. So if there's something in our planning and zoning documents that you wish to comment on, I hope to provide you with ample opportunities to do so. We have a total of 54 change proposals, so it could take a few meetings. When we're done, we'll schedule a formal hearing to amend the land use code and the city ordinances and vote on the package we have discussed with any changes included. And that process will take 2 public hearings, and the changes will be implemented 30 days later. I'd like to remind council members and the public that while we all have things we want to say, we need to be polite, courteous, and follow the council rules, or else it gets difficult to hear each other and have an orderly meeting. And so with that, we'll get started on the use of city-owned land permit for the farmer's market, and I believe Teresa will be introducing that.
Sure. So we have received the application for the farmer's market to use Lions Park on Saturday morning. That's the largest change this year from last year, that it won't be Friday afternoons any longer. They're requesting use of Lions Park on Saturday morning from, I think it was 8 o'clock to noon. Chris, is that more or less? Yeah, 8-ish to noonish. And that, they do, anticipate, getting a waiver for the fee with, use of in-kind services. That would be monitored and passed through city planner Courtney. And then these are a number of things, the activities that the Parks Board brings up that they could participate in. There's also been information provided, notification to all the neighbors surrounding Lions Park. And we had received the 3 letters of approval or, acknowledgement that there are no issues from both Chief Schrock as well as Tim Ryan and Jim. Push now, my mind's got blank, sorry. So I think everything looks like it's in order. They've attached the liability insurance, and I know that there have been questions about maybe there's conflicting activities that could occur because it's Saturday and everybody wants to use the park, and that they have already said that they would adjust their schedule and or move to different parts and mediate or work something out with whoever it is that's trying to use it. So with that, I guess, if there are any questions or.
Does anybody have any questions about this request? All right, then we'll have it on the agenda for the next meeting. The next thing is a resolution, and there's 3 resolutions, and Jody is going to introduce them.
Move to approve resolution 3593, adopting provisions of the Hatch Act, a resolution by the City Council of the City of Red Lodge to adopt the provisions of the Hatch Act.
Is there a second?
I second it.
Discussion.
We were told that, I'm sorry, did you want to go ahead? Okay, I had some questions on this because I didn't really quite understand why the city had to adopt it, because the city employees are already, by law, by state law, beholden to it, covered by it. And Dennison did some research for us. Did you want to speak on that, Dennison? No? Okay. But basically, because we're getting CARES Act funding for the CDBG grant, we are required to actually put these as a resolution.
Any further discussion? Does anybody from the public have anything they'd like to say, online or in person? Roll call?
Battle? Yes. Sherman?
Yes.
Kelly?
Yes.
Keaton?
Yes.
Ronnie? Yes. Clifford?
Yes. Next up is resolution 3594. Jody?
Move to approve resolution 3594, a resolution by the City Council of the City of Red Lodge establishing fair housing for the City of Red Lodge.
I second that.
And this has to be done for the same reason that we have to do the Hatch Act. There is nothing really new in here. This is exactly, the wording is exactly the way that the state of Montana's Fair Housing Act is. So we're not changing anything on that. And once again, Dennison did his research for us to find that, yes, we do need to pass this in order to access the CARES funding for the grant.
Thanks. Any discussion at the table? Any comments from the public? In person or online? Roll call?
Battle?
Yes.
Sherman?
Yes.
Kelly?
Yes.
Keaton?
Yes.
Ronnie? Yes.
Yeah. The final resolution is 3595, and Jody will also introduce that.
Move to approve resolution 3595, budgetary authority resolution for the appropriation of Community Development Block Grant, CDBG, non-provisional funds for subrecipient Red Lodge Area Community Foundation for the completion of a housing study to provide market and suitability information for an affordable housing development project.
I second.
Wow.
Any discussion or questions? Any discussion or questions from the public? How about online? Does anybody have anything they want to talk about with this resolution? All right, roll call?
Battle? Yes. Sherman?
Yes.
Kelly?
Yes.
Keaton?
Yes.
Ronnie? Yes. Whistler?
Yes.
Okay, now we're down to zoning. So I'm gonna ask Courtney to introduce each item, and then the council may ask questions. I'll periodically invite comments from the public, and then we'll see if the council is overall in favor of, opposed to, or wishing to amend. These provisions have been discussed at length by our planning commission over the past year. However, if there are serious reservations that you would like to have considered, now is the time. Remember, we aren't going to agree on everything, and constructive comments and suggestions can be helpful. So we'll get started on that. Courtney, would you like to start with the list?
Yes, thank you. So the first on the list is in regards to the entire section of 4.1, where in the 2016 version, the term "this ordinance" was used, and we replaced it with "these regulations." And so that was just a general conversation that once this is adopted, it's an ordinance itself, but the actual language in here are regulations. And so that was generally why that one was changed. And so that's multiple times throughout that entire section. So that's that one. Courtney, when I was reading through that, it actually hadn't been changed yet in the document. In the one that you have? On the one that was sent out.
The 2022 May 12th one?
Yeah, it still says this ordinance. It doesn't say these regulations. They're the short title.
Yeah, and the next one too, 4.1.20 authority. It says this ordinance.
Well, I think it's just the first one. So because the short title is this ordinance because it's in reference to the actual ordinance.
Okay.
Oh, but then there's later on, purpose and intent. The purpose and intent of these zoning regulations are to, and then following that, there should be more times where it says these regulations. So and that's a little bit why, because there's a difference between when we refer to this ordinance and these regulations.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Would you like to move on to number 2?
If no one has any
Any questions about that? Okay.
So number 2, new dimensional standards illustration figures for all zoning districts that illustrate chimney is not included in building height, and so that's just a figure change where when we try to illustrate what's the maximum height of a building, the chimney was included, but it's actually not included in the overall calculation of the building height. So we just created a new image to represent that.
Any comments or questions from the table? Any comments or questions from the public? Any comments or questions online? Is that okay with the table, the opposition to it? Okay. All right, number 3. Courtney?
All right, so in our 4 residential zoning districts, the planning board changed language to some of the subsections. So I didn't include the letter of the subsections because it might be different depending on which, but it's the last 2 underneath specific district standards. And you should see it's the last 2. There's a section for residential appearance, and then there's a section for livable space. And so the intention of that was to be more clear about our residential areas and that we want them to look like residential areas, and the principal use is for having living space, and so we don't want it to become where there's an overwhelming use of storage, of having storage buildings on lots and then very little actual livable space. So there is a definition included in the livable space to just be clear of what's calculated in that livable space. I know there's questions on this one.
Sure. Yeah, so I'd just like to find out what the motivation was behind adding residential appearance, because that's very vague. And so I'd like to hear about it.
Yes, so there's been some development in some of the residential districts that to the planning board don't look like homes, they don't actually look like residences. So the term pole barns is used because there's a couple of scenarios, quite a few scenarios where we've seen, you know, what look like more like barns than an actual home. So to us, that means that we're not clear enough that we want a residential appearance. And so in other cities or, you know, Billings, for example, they, for each district, they'll say minimum number of windows need to be used, or only these types of roof styles are allowed in them. So we didn't want to go that far to be that specific. We wanted to give people some flexibility, but we also want to say that we want a variety of, you know, roof pitches, roof styles. We don't just want long, monotonous buildings. We want them to look like homes and reflect the residences around them.
Any other questions from the table or comments?
I just have one question about in the document where we're talking about where we're going through each one of these, and the quote is livable space. You're mentioning livable space, and I'm seeing in this document a number of times where it says living area.
Yeah.
So is it just the case that we need to bring all up to say livable space, or what is the definition?
No, so the living area is the name of the subsection, and I should have used that. Sorry,
Okay, so it should be
living area
living
in
area.
the amendment, yeah, and then we use the term livable space within that subsection. But the title is actually living area.
okay. I think I'm clear. Thank you.
Okay.
Madam
Okay.
Chair,
Okay, I'll get to you, just a minute. Oh, wait, okay, go ahead, Al. Al Bloomer is on the planning commission, so Al, go ahead.
I would just want to emphasize that the livable space had to be 51%.
Thank you. Any more comments? Terry?
Yeah, I just want to kind of go back to the residential appearance here, because I'm a little bit confused when it says criteria for evaluating residential appearance include but are not limited to size and placement of windows and doors, building materials, and site design. So I just want to find out when you talk about the various things, so someone's going to be telling somebody how many windows they can have, or who's going to be determining that? Because, you know, that's kind of subjective.
I mean, it's just a little subjective, but it's also not. So, like I said, like Billings, for some of their residential districts, they say they have to have a minimum of 15% area of windows. And so there are some standards out there, and also what we want, you know, people to look at is what's compatible with what's around them, what's surrounding them. And so
what does that mean?
So
Exactly.
if you're in a zoning district, in a residential district that, you know, there are buildings around you that use metal siding, then that could be considered. Or if it's primarily a different material, we want you to consider kind of filling in with that area. So R4 is a little different because it's our high density, and we want to encourage, you know, some different styles of housing, of homes. So that's why we struck the historical character section from there, because we wanted to be amendable for that. But it's a little, like I said, it is a little subjective, but we also didn't want to be too restrictive in telling people they have to have these number of windows. But
Right. Well, I guess that's why to me, adding that, I don't really agree with that. I mean, right now, there's such a push on using, you know, sustainable building materials such as metal, which I know there's been a lot of people that don't like metal, but it's sustainable. It also it can be put directly on wood. It doesn't go in the landfill if it's replaced. And I know that, you know, we're kind of proponents for that. So that's one thing, they're efficient. And, you know, right now, with the cost of building materials, it's very expensive a lot of times to have wood houses. So metal buildings are becoming more and more popular in this farm dominiums and things like that, which would also allow people that build these to provide housing, right? So I just think that this is a very restrictive.
well, one thing we didn't do that other cities unintentionally do is they restrict pole buildings
completely, and so what they want to restrict is the look of a pole building, but what they end up doing is restricting the actual structural style of a pole building, which is more affordable. And so we didn't want to restrict the style of a pole structure. We don't want to have the look of something that's traditionally a barn or what looks like a barn or storage area. So there's various pitches that I've seen metal sided houses in some of the residential areas where they do look really nice. They do look like homes because they have, various pitches in the roof, lots of windows, and so we just want to encourage people to think more of their design when they go into that. And there's some of the planning board members that did a lot of research on this, and they want to speak up on it because this was one of our most recent.
Yeah, I'd welcome some input on that.
Are there planning board members that would like to speak to that question? Go ahead.
Sandy Conley. Yeah, we didn't put a restriction against metal siding. We did a restriction against a pole barn because there was a pole barn that was put up with a very small living space upstairs. Really what they wanted was a garage. And so then they edged it from a garage. They actually built a garage with a little bit of living space. And that's why we had decided that 51% of the building needs to be livable space. We don't want pole barns in town as a building. We have a very unique town with a wonderful historic character. We like the historic character, and that's why we said no pole barns. We didn't say no metal. You can use metal as an accent. It kind of looks sticky as a pole thing, and I've never seen it completely used. I've always seen it as an accent. Usually the metal and the stack stone or some sort of stone, and it's a nice look. And we're not Bozeman or Billings where you say you have to have 7 windows. We don't want to get crazy with this and restrictive because there aren't a whole lot of lots available in Red Lodge to build to start with. But those that we do have, we'd like to have nice looking homes, and we want it to look like a home.
Thank you, Sandy. Dave?
Dave Westwood, former member of the planning board, and some of these conversations extend back over a year, so you'll have to understand that some of the conversations are fuzzy. When I first started hearing Alderman, I can't remember, Aleppo Terry, I know people by first names. What I heard was a concern that was ambiguous, and my recollection is that they went with residential appearance to avoid being too nailed down and saying 20% windows, 7 windows, 2 split, and so they went with a residential appearance. My 2 cents is, I would think it would be in the purview of the council if you say that's too ambiguous, we'd rather have the details. That was a judgment from that board to put an umbrella that covered it without going into the nitty gritty, and then leave that up to a planning director to do that. And if the thinking is, please revisit that, go into that nitty gritty, make that request. But at the time it was to keep it residential looking without going into, and this is what we mean by that. So that was the first part I heard was it sounds ambiguous, but then the second part, it sounded like a little bit like a shift that was like, oh no, I don't want to be telling people what to do. And yet that is part of what the planning board does do, is set those guidance and directions.
Thank you, Dave. Are there any other comments from the table?
Yeah, I guess the thing is I'm just trying to understand why we would put that in there, because there's several metal buildings that don't have stone on them that are in town that are being used to store people's toys. As we know, that's a huge issue here. And because of the cost, they're able also to have apartments and provide housing, long-term housing to people. So I guess my point is that, because something doesn't have stone or doesn't look like somebody else's maybe interpretation of what residential looks like, does not mean I don't believe that it shouldn't be able to be in town. So I guess, that's sort of my concern. I mean, one of the things I've heard from A lot of people in town, it's this whole thing about, you know, we want to preserve agricultural land outside of town. That's why we're doing higher density. And to have higher density in town, a lot of people have a lot of toys. And so people are going to want to build these barn dominiums and different sorts of metal buildings so that they can contain their toys and at the same time, you know, using the 51% rule, providing workforce housing. So I guess my point is I would just hate to see that option going away because someone doesn't like the way a metal building looks if it doesn't have stone or whatever. That's kind of the way I look at it.
Go ahead, Sandy.
I believe that it's not in the R4, correct?
It
We don't
is,
have residential appearance. No, in the R4 where the multifamily and high density.
it is in the
It
R4.
has residential appearance.
Yeah, we struck the
All the
historic character out of the
Oh, we
R4.
struck the historic out.
Because that really is one of the limiting things too, is we want to preserve that historic character. And so that in itself is also a little bit of a guidance for people of how we want that development. And so that's why it was struck from the R4, because that was also a very heavy conversation, a long conversation of, we want to have places, and there's a lot of parcels in the R4 zoning district where we want to encourage more modern style homes that aren't necessarily in areas where, I'm sorry, the C2 maybe is where we struck it. I might be incorrect on that.
There's no historic.
And it's, yeah.
Yeah, there's no historic.
No, thank you.
Thank you. Dave?
And I think it's just worth noting too that all of these things are impact only future development. None of it impacts any development that's already in there, so.
I would also add that, you know, we use the growth policy as our guidance for these, and this is what the people have asked us to do. They want to preserve the look of Red Lodge, and because of that, that's our guiding document when we do the zoning.
Thank you. Are there any further comments at the table?
Yes.
Pete?
Having served as chair of the city planning board and also the county planning board, this is a Herculean effort. And I think the planning commission and the planning department should be complimented for all of the detail and work that went into this. And yes, there's going to be questions, but nonetheless, it was a huge job and it's well appreciated.
Any comments from the public? Further
Madam
comments?
Chair,
Okay, just, go ahead, Al.
Al Bloomer here. I think Dave and Sandy really covered it. What we're just trying to do is come up with some language that the building should fit, and we couldn't define it. And I see some questions on the chat about defining livable space. Sandy, do you want to address that? How we define livable space?
It seems kind of obvious. Livable space is that space you live in, which doesn't include garages. So bedrooms, bathrooms, living room, kitchen, mud rooms, laundry rooms, bonus rooms.
And it is added in the living area. I think it's the last sentence. Livable space includes.
Yeah, it's interior, means the interior habitable area of the dwelling units, including the basement and attics, but not including a garage or any accessory building or structure where the use is primarily for storage.
And it didn't include stairwells and things like that, right, Sandy? It's just where people can live. Now, there was a question on the chat about, well, if I store stuff in a guest room, well, that's still a livable space that you chose to use for another reason. But as Sandy said, I think livable space for inhabitants or potential inhabitants is pretty self-defining.
Thank you. Sandy?
I believe that does include stairwells. It's really hard to take that out of square footage. I think when an appraisal is done of a home, the square footage of the stairwell is included because it's very difficult to take out.
Okay, thanks. Hey, Dave?
I was just going to add, there are a lot of terms in here. Almost every term that has ambiguity in it, go look, and the chances are we spent great effort and time defining it in terms. So there's a lot of back and forth and cross-reference. And then the other thing I was just going to add, and I appreciate the Herculean effort that went into summarizing these changes. But at the same time, as part of that process, I can tell you this isn't all complete. So I would encourage, I wish I have not had this before as a member of council, so I really appreciate it because it kind of directs your focus to here and there. But I also think it's worth reading the whole document when you get an opportunity to do so as well.
Thank you. Any more comments from the public? All right, how many, do we have disagreement at the table here? How many? Terry?
Say again.
Is there a disagreement? I'm just trying
No.
to get, when we present the whole thing, we want to know what we're not agreeing on informally so that we can take care of that in the next meeting or when it's scheduled. So it sounds like we're all good, so we can move on. Courtney?
Okay, number 4, section 4.3.94, subsection G, prevailing setbacks, removed to allow for flexibility in the R4, which is a high-density district. So that was one of our more recent changes as well. So prevailing setbacks generally means if you look at the block and majority of the homes are set back 10 feet, but our zoning regulations say that they need to be, at a different feet, then we look at the prevailing setback, because we don't want one house that's, off. If there's a standard that's already met in the frontage, we don't want one house that's sticking out. And so that's generally the prevailing setback. However, in a high density area, where we're trying to encourage the more modern styled homes, the prevailing setback is more for, a historic like neighborhood, and that's not really the style that we're encouraging in the R4.
Thank you. Any questions or comments at the table? Teresa?
I like the idea of striking that when you've got a higher density area, because we talked about having the ability to have things set back, and then you get a stagger, you get some more isolation, a little bit of a breakup, and it's, not on top of it. So I think that's a good thing.
Any more comments at the table? Any comments from the public on the floor? Any comments from the public online? Anyone in disagreement with this part? Courtney, you want to move on to 5?
Number 5, table 4.3.102 in the C1, and it's 4.3.112 for the C2. Those are our two of our commercial districts. So those are our allowed uses table, and drive-through facilities were taken out from allowed conditional uses. So we're essentially saying that we do not want to allow any drive-through facilities in those commercial districts.
Any questions, comments from the table?
I'm just curious why.
One of the first things that we did it was over a year ago.
I think that the question was that the C1 and C2 are not the community entrances, they're closer to the downtown. And it's very difficult to drive in and out. We had a drive-through for the Wells Fargo kiosk, and there's a lot of people that were walking in that area, and it was a very difficult way to, which way they're going to be going. We were going to make a one-way, and we ended up striking or not allowing. It was a conditional use, so we did not allow a drive-through for that, simply because there's too many people walking in that district. So C1 and C2, we removed it just to allow our pedestrians not to get run over by drive-through.
Thank you. Any more comments or questions from the table? Any comments or questions from the public in person? Any comments or questions from the public online? Is there any disagreement with moving this forward? All right, thank you. Number 6.
Number 6 is in the C1 table 4.3.102. Commercial entertainment was added as a conditional use. So this is specifically in response to a suggested change to the zoning map of, increasing the C1 further south to 19th Street. And so currently that's Community Entrance South. It used to be the C1. So we would like to change it back, but we're also cognizant that the Roosevelt Center would be included in that C1. And so we wanted to make sure that the Roosevelt Center is able to continue doing the special events, any concerts, theatrical, plays that they would like to do. So we added as a conditional use with the Roosevelt Center in mind.
Any comments or questions from the table?
I have a question, not specific to this change, but just you brought up something that is interesting to me, which is we've got this new map to look at, which is excellent. And for me, it would be very useful to see the old map and like the highlighted spots where these changes are occurring. And I think it would be great for the public to see that too. Is it possible to produce that in a way that we can all?
Yeah, and I had, a year ago when we had started talking about this, I had kind of created just like a little graphic for the planning board to see what those changes would be, but I can definitely make a map that would just highlight that specific area.
I think that would be very helpful.
Is the current online one still the old map?
Yep.
Right, but it would be nice to see some of the
totally
highlighted changes.
Thank you.
Sandy, Courtney, didn't we just make a change in that community entrance south and C1, and that was it? Isn't that the only change on the zoning map?
That's the only change.
We cleaned it up some because there were some things that were wrong on it, and you'll notice the colors are better.
Yes,
Thank you, Courtney.
Neil did a lot of work before I started of making sure that parcels that were incorrectly zoned were fixed and adding new, so he did a lot of the work on that.
Any more questions or comments at the table? Any questions or comments in person, in the building, in the audience here? Any comments or questions online? Any disagreement with this provision? All right, item 7, Courtney?
Okay, so it is in the C2, table 4.3, section 4.3.114, subsection Z, historic character, removed to allow for differing building typologies. And so I was incorrect. It's in the C2 that we removed historic character. And that is because in the C2, there are not a lot of historic buildings. And again, it's a commercial and a residential. It's sort of a mixed use area. So we felt like the historic character was a little restrictive to the types of buildings that people could put there.
Thank you. Any comments or questions at the table? Any comments or questions in public? Public comments or questions? Any comments or questions online? Any disagreements with this provision?
Just a quick question.
Okay.
Within that C2, is that where one of the, Courtney, that just got permitted for the multiplex building to be?
The eight units?
Yeah, is that within C2?
That's the C2.
Yeah, is it in C2?
C2.
Okay, thank you.
I just had to delete it.
Oh, that.
Yeah. that one.
Is there any disagreement with this provision, or can we move it forward? Okay. Did I ask if everybody got a chance to? Okay. 8, art galleries.
8, so that's another one from our last meeting. So all commercial districts, art gallery is allowed as a principal use. And so one thing to, just to kind of bring up in our allowed uses tables, if something is listed in one place but not in others, then it's considered not allowed. And so art gallery was in one commercial district, but for some reason not in any of the other ones. So we just want to be able, if someone wants to open up an art gallery in a commercial district, we think that should be allowed.
All right. Any comments or questions at the table? Any comments or questions on the floor? Any comments or questions online? Any disagreement with moving it forward? All right, number 9.
Number 9, that was also one of the first ones that we removed, but use of drive it from historic character across the board. And so that is, you know, in those historic character sections, typically the last sentence talks about stucco and other similar materials. It used to say stucco, drive it, and other similar materials. So we just struck drive it because we don't want drive it not compatible with the weather, the area of Red Lodge, our weather conditions and historic character.
Any questions at the table? Any questions or comments from the floor? Any questions or comments online? Any disagreement with moving that forward? All right, number 10.
For all commercial districts, so the sentence usually says, and I should have clarified where that one is more. So for all commercial districts, this will be in the non-residential uses section. So typically one of the last ones in those specific district standards. And so we added language to say allow commercial uses and all conditional uses that propose to construct or expand gross floor area, and we added by 2,000 square feet or more. And so this is a new regulation that we're putting in place. And so so if somebody comes to us with something that's allowed, but it's 2,000 square feet or more, that's considered to us a big enough project that we would like them to come to planning board for a conditional use permit. So it's been something that we do anyways. It's in table 4.9 at the end. And what I had found is when I did a pre-application meeting with someone, it was hard for me to find that language in that district. So we just wanted to make it more clear to people who are, when they are thinking of doing a development and they look at the specific district that they want to develop in, that if it's, even if it's allowed, if it's 2,000 square feet, it's a large project and they need to come to planning board.
Thank you. Any questions or comments at the table? Any questions or comments on the floor? Any questions or comments online? Is everyone in agreement to move it forward? Yeah. All right, number 11.
Table 4.3.123 in the commercial entrance north. We increased the allowable building height to 40 feet. So originally we had considered changing it to 40 in both the north and the south commercial entrances, but we decided to keep it 35 feet in the commercial entrance south. So we had discussion over protecting the view shed and where 40 feet might be more impactful or less impactful in each of the districts. And so we would like to allow in those commercial entrances for 3-story buildings, so denser development and being able to do a 3-story and 35 feet. It's pretty hard to do a 3-story building at 35 feet.
Any questions or comments at the table? Any questions or comments on the floor? Yes.
I think the reason why we were okay to go to 40 feet is just like what you see on Shiloh, where you have commercial on the bottom and 2 levels of residential. So we were trying to encourage residential over commercial, and that's what the 40 feet. And it's in the community entrance north, so it's not really hitting anybody's view shed, because across the highway is big land and U-Haul.
Thank you. Any more comments on the floor? Any more comments online? And no disagreement? All right, number 12.
So number 12 is in the Central Business District C4, table 4.3.142. So from those conditional uses, we removed drive-through facilities and outdoor storage. I feel like that one's self-explanatory, but if you have questions.
Any comments or questions at the table? Any comments or questions on the floor? Any comments or questions online? All right, 13.
Table 4.3.162, the P2, that's public. So that allowed use of tables. So what I had originally found when I was brand spanking new is that we had language for conditional uses for that table, but we didn't actually have any conditional uses in the table. And so I had proposed striking that language, but then once we had more discussion, we decided to move schools, governmental buildings and facilities to conditional uses. So any future school or government building or facility would have to come through planning board.
Thank you. Any comments or questions from the table? Any comments or questions from the floor? Any comments or questions online? Any disagreements? Just moving it forward. All right, 14.
Table 4.3.164. So this is a brand new table. So we, in the overlay zoning district for the Skyline overlay zoning district, this is to protect the view of the benches. And so there was a lot of confusion over the language and subsection D building height of what it meant. And then we realized if we're not clear, you know, amongst the planning board, how do we expect other people to be clear? So we added this table to provide an example of what we mean by as you increase the setback from the edge of the bench, you can increase the height of the building.
Any comments or questions from the table?
I have a question, again, not specific to the addition of this table, I think that's fine. The previous page has a map of all of the overlays, and it doesn't look like the Skyline overlay is on there. Is it somewhere else, or is it?
No, because it's hard to map the Skyline overlay district because it is so dependent on the actual height of buildings and how far back you are from the edge, and so there's no actual delineation of what is. It's just along the benches, and so it would also be a lot to map out. And it's never been mapped out, to my knowledge.
I wonder if we could just include some language that explains why it's not there, because it definitely is a little glaring for someone who's just looking for the data, but that makes sense to me.
Any more comments or questions from the table? Any comments or questions from the floor? Any comments or questions online? Any disagreement with moving it forward? 15.
Section 4.4.22, get there. So 4.4.2 is our use-specific standards. 4.4.22, specific uses, subsection A, bed and breakfast. Number 6, parking requirements. We changed the parking requirements for bed and breakfast from 1 parking for each room to 1 parking space for every 2 rooms. And so this language, when we did some work on our parking, required off-street parking table, this language reflects those changes that we made when we were working on that table. And so our goal with parking reductions is to reduce impermeable space, increase the amount of buildable space that people can have, and also increase the affordability of someone who wants to put, you know, an ADU or something, so they aren't required to do a parking space. And so it makes it more affordable for them to do that.
Any comments or questions at the table? Any comments or questions on the floor? Any comments or questions online? All right. Any disagreement with moving it forward? 16.
So 16 is subsection D in that same 4.4.22, manufactured home communities. And tiny homes were included in the language here, and we added a definition to section 4.11 of what's considered a tiny home.
Comments or questions from the table? Comments or questions from the floor? Comments or questions online? Any disagreement on moving it forward? All right, number 17.
So in that same manufactured home communities, number 4, manufactured, oh God, I lost myself. Yeah, C. No, it'll
or
everything.
post-factory home improvement?
Yeah, permits and inspections, and then number 4, post-factory home improvements to manufactured homes, subject to the International Building Code. So we changed the title of that, so we added the post-factory language, to that.
Any comments or questions on the table? Any comments or questions on the floor? Any comments or questions online? Any disagreement with moving it forward? All right, then 18.
18, 4.4.22F, and really this is in a lot of areas throughout the entire document. So we didn't have language for accessory dwelling units, we just had guest houses, and so that's in our parking and allowed use tables. You know, anywhere else we reference guest houses, we wanted to make sure that we recognize that accessory dwelling units are different, but we do allow them, and we to be more clear to people that we do accessory dwelling units, and that's a much more common term in today's time. So we just added that wherever we had guest houses, and a definition was added at the end.
Comments or questions from the table?
One thing, a question about the size of an ADU.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a common practice to have a limit on the size of an ADU?
Yeah, and 1,200 is pretty standard. I looked into that, and I mean, some homes are smaller, some don't mention, but 1,200 is pretty, even like some of the research that I was looking up, they even reference like towns like to use 1,200 square feet. So
does it still have that the primary home has to be larger than the guest house, the accessory dwelling unit?
not in square space, in square footage. So the original one was that the accessory can't be taller than the principal, and we struck that from the definition because we know that there are a lot of people who would like to put an accessory dwelling unit above a garage and can't. So that's why we changed that, so that people can actually provide hopefully long-term.
Yes,
housing.
exactly.
Yeah.
Before we go on, I'd just like for you to reiterate that or clarify that. What was the purpose of adding EU language in all these locations?
So we had a couple of people who weren't sure if they could build an accessory dwelling unit because we never actually said an accessory dwelling unit. It was always guest houses. And a guest house is, by definition of development of the building code, different from an accessory dwelling unit.
And was the planning board discussion, I'd be curious to hear from the planning board, was the planning board discussion around that the addition of the ADU language would help provide more options for folks hoping to do things like put in long-term rentals above their garages and things like that?
Dave?
That was absolutely the purpose of it. And there was actually, as you go through and read it, you'll see a couple of trends there. One of them was a lot of the previous language actually spoke to the uses rather than the structure, and so we tried to clarify and separate between those. And then there were, some of them do have specific terms and have meanings per building code and stuff. So that's, and Courtney already addressed that. So
It wasn't a direct response from the public and what the public is wanting to be able to do.
And the other part that had to do with the space, there was a lot of discussion, and I'm trying to remember, we may come across it, when you were talking about size and comparable, one of the concerns was making sure that we, A, increase long-term housing possibility, but at the same time, don't eliminate permeable space for water runoff. So that was one of the other concerns in there. So that came into play a couple of times as well.
Before we move on, I don't see in section F, accessory dwelling unit description here, any limitations on turning an ADU into a short-term rental. Am I misunderstanding it, or
Of what
is that
an
an
accessory
option?
dwelling unit is, or,
Just accessory dwelling unit, relationship to principal dwelling size per lot, no home occupation, parking. I guess my question is, I understand the intent of adding the ADU language.
Oh.
I don't know that adding the language protects that
Yeah.
usage for what it was intended for. And I'm not saying that, I'm just pointing
Yeah.
that out. Yep. Or, sorry.
Sandy, I think the thought behind doing a deed restriction on an ADU runs with the land forever, and we don't know what forever is going to show. So no, we didn't specify the use of an ADU, just that there was a possibility of an ADU. As far as the size goes, a lot of houses in Red Lodge are under 1,200 square feet, my own in particular. So 1,200 square feet is a lot, is a whole house, okay? I'll go for a few more square feet. But that's why we didn't restrict the use of an ADU, but we did encourage ADUs.
That was part of the discussion too, and James was here when we did that, but one of the things he addressed is what you can legally do and legally can't do. And so the concern was make it so they can't build it, but it got really hairy if you started telling people you could build it, but only use it for X and forever. We looked at different mechanisms, but it was mostly just increase the inventory and cross your fingers.
And we talked about the difference between a guest house and an ADU. A guest house, you don't normally charge someone to stay there. An ADU, you do. Well, maybe, but you have that option. But a guest house is for a guest of the, it's different.
Any more questions at the table? Any more questions, comments from the floor? Al, did you have something?
Yeah, first of all, it's really hard for me to participate from 2,200 miles away, so I'm really glad Sandy and Dave were there to speak on behalf of the board. But one of the things on the guest house was too, it was not going to be a permanent residence. It's a short-term resident, and I think that was reiterated in the document.
Thank you. Any more comments from the floor? Any more comments online? Any disagreement moving it forward? All right. 19.
19 is for subsection, same area, 4.4.22, subsection G, which is on page 4.4-9, temporary uses. So in that one, number 2, temporary use permit, that title was changed from, what was it changed from? Administrative approval to temporary use permit application. And so that's because we actually have a temporary use permit that people apply for if they're planning on something that's temporary use, and that application gives the zoning administrator, the planning director, the ability to deny something if it's something that is no longer has become a temporary use. There's a lot of standards that they have to meet in that application process. So that was the justification behind changing the title.
Any questions or comments at the table? Any questions or comments on the floor? Any questions or comments online? Any disagreement moving it forward? All right, number 20.
Number 20 is one of the ones I addressed in that kind of cover letter, I guess. So it's not common practice for cities to say that, it is common practice for us to say the temporary use is this amount of duration, so 6 months is pretty standard. But what's not common is for us to say after a year, you have to leave the city limits for 6 months before you can come back and do it again. So we wanted to do a couple of things. We wanted to just follow suit of more what's common practice of how you should word your temporary uses, and the other is to allow for, if they come to the city and get a business license and a temporary use permit, and then they want to do it for more than, if they do end up doing it for more than a year, it gets a little complicated for them to try to remember which license expires when and to come back in 6 months. So it's easier for them to come back, renew a business license at the same time, renew a temporary use permit.
Thank you. Any comments or questions at the table? Well, I have one. This issue wasn't this part of the issue when there was a bus? And so, and wasn't the bus have to move because they've been here for too long? And they competed with other businesses, and my recollection is that it was not fair because they didn't have to pay all the things that a brick and mortar restaurant had to do. So how does this address that concern? Is it in sync with that?
Well, I don't know if back then that there was actually an application for something that's not a permanent structure. I don't know if back then if they actually had a process in place to regulate that. So now, if someone came to me and I approved a 6-month temporary use permit and it doesn't go well, or we get a lot of complaints, or, you know, X number of reasons, we can deny a renewal of that permit, and they have to move. So I think that temporary use application helps with that a little bit. And I think there is a lot of perception of what, like, food trucks don't have to pay for compared to brick and mortars, and there is a little bit of balance. But both the last one that was here, I mean, they said they invested $100,000 in that food truck, plus, you know, all of the other things, and they pay resort taxes. You know, they have a business license, so they are paying the resort taxes to the city. So, and I don't foresee it becoming an issue. We don't get phone calls often for something for food truck that wants to be here more than a weekend for a special event.
Yes, Dave.
I'm with the mayor on this one. I remember the part of this was, how do we keep from creating an uneven playing field for our brick and mortar businesses that are in town? And I think this happened after I was off planning board. I don't remember this conversation, but I would have a concern about what we're doing to not create an uneven playing field.
And they do pay rent. So if they were renting a brick and mortar versus a space for their, you know, for their restaurant, mobile restaurant, it's not, they're not paying property tax, but neither does someone who's renting a space as a general rule.
And they do have to be set back so many feet from other property. So and part of, we didn't discuss it in detail, but there is limited space where somebody could actually put a food truck in town. And so that, again, like, we didn't feel like there's enough space for people for it to be overwhelming. If it came to that point where we had a lot of people applying for temporary use permits and wanted to be here 6 months at a time, then I think we need to create separate language for food trucks specifically, because temporary uses is more than a food truck. It's a temporary building or a development that's just meant to be there for a few months while the development's happening. So we could then create food truck language, but again, it hasn't been a problem. And the one that is here currently, they just bought property to become a brick and mortar, so that one's not even going to be a permanent issue.
I remember when they had the big upset about the Los Nidos bus and the hot dog stand. But part of the thing was that those two were actually set up in the city right away, and they were not paying rent. And the reason why this came up is because this barbecue trailer, you know, if they were searching for a place, but they were having a really hard time finding one. But they were renting the lot, they weren't in the city right away, they were paying rent on the lot to a property owner here in town. So to me, it is two different things. I mean, they are paying their resort tax, they're paying their business license, they're paying rent to a property owner here in town. So, you know, whether or not we need to address that through the application process, because I don't know that anybody can actually just go set up in the city right away anymore, because I think we did away with that as well.
Yeah.
Planning board, Sandy?
I think what we did and what was presented is that we were doing the same thing that the county was doing. The county had a rule that it was 1 year that's renewable afterwards, and I think we did 6 months renewable for an additional 6 months, and then renewable after that. You don't have to move for 6 months. So we just basically adopted what the county was doing. It's his fault.
I have a question on what these temporary, and I'll use the food truck because I understand a temporary office while you're building a big building, but what they're doing for water and sewer, if they're permanently parked there, then, and they're in a spot that, unless they have a clean out right by them, which I don't think there, you know, is any of those, how are we monitoring what they're doing with their sewage and all of that? And, you know, I think obviously we do need to have some kind of food truck ordinance at some point.
Yeah, so that's part of the temporary use application, is they have to explain how they are taking care of that. And with food trucks, typically they have like a separate like storage for like any gray water, or they usually don't use like for waste, and then they use the restrooms in there. So that's another part of the application, is what kind of restroom facilities are available nearby. So in that specific one, they took their gray water off-site and they dumped it on another property that they own, where they could dump it legally.
Any more questions or comments at the table? Any more comments on the floor from the planning board? Any comments online? Any disagreement with moving it forward? Okay. Number 21.
21, 4.4.22, so same section, H, which is our sexually oriented businesses. And so that one, sorry, I'm getting confused. That one we had language for separation from other uses, and the separation was for, shall we set back a minimum of, was 250 feet from the boundary of a lot or a parcel that contains a church, public or private school, public park, or a medical marijuana dispensary. So we changed that to 300 because in our next section we used 300, so we changed it to be consistent.
Any questions or comments? Terry?
Yeah, I just have a question of why we're putting a medical marijuana dispensary in the same thing with sexually oriented businesses, and it wouldn't be with a liquor store or something more along that line.
I think it's just how state law views the two differently.
So sorry, I just want to interrupt because I think you misunderstand actually. So the document, the part that I'm looking at, sexually oriented business definition, and then another section, marijuana dispensary. And I think Courtney's point here is just the 300 feet is now congruent or now consistent in both areas, not that medical marijuana is under.
No, I realize that. I'm just curious why isn't it 250 feet for liquor stores?
I don't know that.
I was just curious why 300. I thought it would be the same as alcohol.
Yeah, I don't know what the alcohol one is.
I'm also curious where the 300 feet number came from.
Yeah, so I think is the county 500, like the code, the state is 500. I think the state language.
So
Bill Bullock, 900 Kainu Avenue. Looking at the state language, it's 600 feet from those public facilities, as long as the two facilities are on the same street with the same street address, if that makes sense. So for example, you have liquor store Y on the corner of one block and school on the opposite corner of the same block. And this is First Street and this is 6th Avenue. It's less than 600 feet in that diagonal from one to the other.
And
They have to share the same, street address, and it's 600 feet.
Okay, and so, what James had found with that language is that there's basically nowhere that would be able to be allowed in the city limits, and so that's an issue. We can't have language that says, well, you know, if we ended up allowing it, which the language currently we don't, if we ended up allowing it, it's okay, but you have to be 600 feet away, but then there's nowhere that you can do that. We have to still provide options for those businesses to be able to get to be established. So the 300, I think, was kind of I don't, you know, that was kind of before I was here, but the 300, you know, he mapped out and measured just to kind of see, like, what's the happy medium of, you know, not allowing too many options, but not, you know, restricting it still.
Any more questions at the table? Hey, Dave, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just gonna add a comment, so, and Polly's here too, so she can jump in if my memory's rusty. This was, a lot of this spacing just had to do with maintaining, and a lot of our conversations are maintaining the feel of the business district and doing it. So, and there was a need to just have a consistent number in there. And my recollection is this was another one of those where it was pretty unanimous, you know, 250 or 300, and they just, you know, went around the table and everybody said 300, and so that's what it was. Is that your recollection too, Paula?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And I think the 300 is a block. So we have 6, you know, lots of 50 feet. So that's where the 300 is just a consistent, easy way to figure something out.
Thank you. Michael, did you have a comment?
I have a question regarding the language. Michael Keys, 408 South McGillen. Does the language actually state medical marijuana dispensaries, or does it state marijuana dispensaries? Because our county has allowance for medical or for marijuana dispensaries. It's not just medical anymore.
It says medical
It
right
says-
now.
The actual section itself is marijuana dispensary, but in the sexually oriented businesses, it says medical marijuana, and that's language that was left over. So that would be something that I think we should strike, since it's no longer just a medical.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you for
And I'll
catching
double
that.
check in the other section.
And I would say that's another one of those take back to the planning board, but I think that would be, they already addressed that a little bit further on, the medical versus medical, or medical marijuana versus marijuana, but I think that was probably just an oversight.
Mhm.
Any more comments from the public? Yes, Bill.
Bill Bullock, 900 Kainu. Just for referencing, I've got our resolution from the county into things, resolution 2022-07, and so far as distances. And, you know, I applaud you guys for looking at, for dialing your distances in reference to your governing body, your municipality. We referenced 1,000 feet setbacks from dwellings and or those public parks, playgrounds, health facilities, libraries, cultural facilities. There's to go that route and dial it down to 300, I think is pretty responsible on your guys' behalf. And I think that there's a lot of reason for that to do it.
Thank you. Any more comments on the floor? Any comments online?
Yeah, I'm having trouble hearing, and maybe Dave covered this and Courtney, but part of the discussion here was that we needed to have the 300 feet because anything in excess of 300 feet would eliminate any possibility of these dwellings. And I think James explained to us that we couldn't do that. We had to give these business an option to operate in terms of the footage and the laws of the land. And so that's why the 300 feet was selected, because it, I believe, gives 2 possible locations within the city. Courtney can correct me on that, but I think the 300 feet gives, based on current zoning, 2 possible locations.
Thank you, Al. Courtney, did you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, and I don't know that specific number. I was trying to do some mapping of it today to see like really realistically how many parcels. And so right now with the way the zoning is, it would only be allowed in the central business district. And then with the 300 foot buffer from those spaces, there's like a few lots between 8th and 14th Street and pretty much, you know, on each side. There's a few lots that it could go. But, and then looking realistically at what would actually be converted into one, it narrows it down even more. So I don't know the specific number.
And to add to that, we wanted to make sure that if they had them, they were only in the commercial districts and not in the residential.
Sandy?
Yeah, there were 2 locations that James, it was before Courtney, that
Right.
James, that could go. So my memory is the same as yours now. There were two possible locations.
Because there was precedent for the 500 and it just didn't work because we would eliminate all spots. So it had to come to the 300. We kind of ratcheted it down until we could find at least 1 or 2 spots that legally they could operate following the other zoning policies of the city.
Michael?
Question on that. So right now, is the way it's written for Red Lodge, is it 300 feet from park, church, or school on the same street or in any direction whatsoever?
It's any direction whatsoever.
Okay.
I double check that after.
May I ask that you consider doing what Bridger just implemented last month or earlier this month and making it 300 feet from parks, schools, or churches on the same street?
That we have to go back to the planning board.
There's nowhere to put it, so it would have to be on the.
My only thought on, is that Michael? My only thought on that, Michael, was that if it was 300 feet from a school, could it be in a residential zone? And that would probably be an issue. If it was stayed in commercial, maybe the planning board can take a look at that.
Well, definitely, I would say put its wording in there that says not in a residential.
Dave?
Current wording references the boundary of the lot or parcel, so that's where that 300 feet is. So it is articulated, but that's where it is 300 feet from the boundary of a lot or parcel.
Right.
Stay on the same.
Yeah.
It doesn't dictate that in our city code.
Teresa?
We let over, I think we were talking
Yeah.
about sexually oriented, the businesses in 300 feet, but while we're on the subject, and if we're talking about not creating an impossibility for marijuana dispensary, maybe we could take it back to the planning board to consider the commercial north and south entrances, which are the least residential of the commercial districts. And that could open some possibilities, even as conditional.
Sandy?
I think the reason why we didn't do it in our community entrances because we didn't do it in our community entrance. We're trying to, according to the growth policy, to make the community entrances look good as visitors are coming into Red Lodge. And so we wanted to keep it in the commercial downtown district. I think that when the medical marijuana was first passed, something went in that horseshoe place, and we had law enforcement talk to us about issues where it's too far away from the downtown for them to properly police. And so, and this was the zoning before this zoning, so we're probably going back 10 years because then it was medical marijuana. And so that's why we went to the downtown commercial, plus we didn't want it on our community entrances.
However, we do have it at our community entrances now, on just the other side of our city boundary.
Yeah.
We're only in charge of our city.
Exactly, but if you're a visitor, it doesn't matter to them. They're seeing it on the way in on the other side of the boundary in our entrances.
Jen?
I would like to suggest that we go back to whether or not there's any questions on 21, get that out of the way. And then, as far as 22 goes, I think there's enough data here to just say this is something we should keep talking about and not necessarily move it forward. But let's go. I didn't want to say that and then forget about 21.
Okay, is there any disagreement with moving 21 forward? All right, then, Courtney, do you want to introduce 22?
22, yes, number 23. So 22, 4.4.22, section I for marijuana dispensaries. So number 2, we got rid of some redundancy. So number 2, we just, at the very end of that, we added or another marijuana dispensary. And we deleted what was the number 3, which basically said the same thing as number 2, but to be separate from another marijuana dispensary. So it was just a little redundant to have both of those sections. So that's what that change was.
Any comments from the table or questions? Any comments from the floor? Yes.
Scott Cope, 14 Summit Lane. What I'm looking at, and correct me if I'm wrong, Courtney, but when I'm looking at these changes, a building containing a dispensary, and it talks about the distance, but then number 3 that's deleted talks about on-site consumption. Are we talking about allowing on-site consumption at these dispensaries in town?
It's not allowed through state code.
Okay, because it's in here, so I was wondering if that's the part you struck.
That's the part that we struck, and I think, again, that was left over from maybe some medical marijuana language, but it's not allowed through state code from what I read. I haven't memorized it, but, yeah, so
Can't have a pop-up.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so any further comment from the floor? Any comment online?
Yeah, just a clarification on the 300 feet. Did you refer that back to the planning board or did you accept it?
Accepted it. We accepted it in regards
Okay.
to the granted businesses.
All right, thank you.
So with regards to item number 22, is there any disagreement with moving that forward? Okay then.
For
I just want
the,
to clarify.
Yes.
I'm fine moving forward with the fact that we removed number 3, but I think one of the things that we didn't talk about, and it's now getting to 7:30, is we're going through these one by one. I would like, before we wrap up tonight, to just discuss, I appreciate that we're going through these first, but I would like to wrap up with an understanding of the process to be sure that we also have the chance to provide discussion on the rest of the document. That's clear about how we move forward from that. So we can keep doing this, but maybe last 15 minutes or something, we can talk about how do we engage with the public and provide feedback on the rest of the document as
On the
well.
rest of the plan document? Are there other, and, you know, we could discuss anything relevant. I know marijuana has been the thing that most of the questions have been about. So we can continue that conversation now, and I'm more than happy to do that with any other topics. And we will provide time at the end for additional topics. Teresa?
I would rather not go into the discussion of it deeply now because it hasn't been advertised, it wasn't prepared. I just don't think, you know, there's a whole different agenda than just going through the zoning document.
Okay.
That's just my opinion.
Is everyone?
I agree. That would have been my main concern, is that it wasn't actually an item on the agenda. It was just zoning documents, you know, and I think people deserve to be able to know about it and participate in the discussion And I think, either the planning board or, the council, it's gonna be a big discussion moving forward on what we wanna do. We wanna limit the number of them. Are we good with the zoning? Or do we keep the federally in there? That's the planning board left in, making it,
And that would go for any other red herrings that we come across beyond this list.
Right,
So-
that's what I'm saying. I don't think that's the appropriate.
Courtney?
I think for me, what I can do from this meeting where we get far enough, and we have more of these types of things, we're discussing it, and then I can try to come up with some alternative language, so it doesn't, and then maybe it doesn't necessarily have to go back to the planning board if city council finds language that, you feel is compatible. So hearing the language about on the same side of the street, I can go back and look at some mapping of that and see like how that would change from having it currently, and just bring back some suggested options that can then be advertised even with the next agenda. If that's something that you guys think would be helpful.
Dave?
Mayor, I would just like to add one comment for way of reference as you guys look at and consider that. I'm reading between the lines and hearing a lot of the conversation revolving around the marijuana dispensary, which currently states that it maintains with Montana code and as well as federal rules. And I just want to make sure that you guys know that had a lot of discussion over multiple meetings with public input, and it was unanimous to keep that in place. So
No, it was not unanimous. I listened
That-
to the recording today.
to the first time through?
10 years ago.
No, I'm talking about last year when we did
June
it.
23rd, I listened to the recording today.
Oh, was it not?
Okay, it was 11.
I stand corrected.
Yes, Bill?
Madam Mayor, if I may, just for some clarification purposes, I did bring a copy of the poll results from last November's election on the ballot initiative. I'm happy to leave that here. You can produce all the copies you want and straight disseminate them at your leisure. But just really quickly, and I don't want to bog down anything, and I know that there's other public comment, but when you look at the voting results across the county, the difference in the vote between yes and no is 81%. The difference in the polls across the county is a little more stark in the fact that the Initiative 190 failed in Cilicia, Joliet Town, Joliet Boyd Rural, Town of Bridger, Bridger Rural, hold on, Belfry, Roberts, Edgar, Luther, but it passed with majorities in Ward 1, Ward 2, and Ward 3 in Red Lodge, and Red Lodge Rural, which gave the total amount enough to carry over the election for a passage in the county. I only offer that up as that's your constituents speaking about. And like I said, I'll leave these there. And the only other comment I would make is the perception countywide and why we acted the way we did is in the balance of the county is where these businesses are beginning to flourish and target where they want to be. I guess it's a big responsibility, and I take my hat off to you guys for doing it, and the fact that, there is some of that perception countywide is that this was forced on the county, but that it's not allowed in town when it's town and town rural that passed it. Again, those are our constituents, those are our people. That was the voice that they had. But again, I'll leave these for your dissemination, and you're welcome to it.
Thank you. All right, so is there any more comment? I guess we already did that one, so we'll move on to item 23.
Item 23. So, item 23 is in relation to amendments that were made in between the 2016 and the 2022. So, for example, the short-term rental section was moved, but it was also updated in 2018 through a very thorough public process. So, those are changes that were added into the 2022 because they were like hoofed animals, fowl, and short-term rentals were done in between.
Any questions or comments at the table? Any questions or comments on the floor? Comments or questions online? Any disagreement with moving it forward? All right, 24.
With that said, 4.4.22, M, short-term rentals, which is on page 4.4-10. So with that, we found a lot of people have been involved with conversations in short-term rentals, and so I think a lot of us found out that some of our definitions, we have definitions for what things are, but then we never reference them again. So so for example, owner occupied short-term rental, we have a definition of what that is, but then we never, I think the intention there was to say that we want our short-term rentals to provide jobs for locals, for if anyone wants to do property management. So we added a section, the section H, under D, change in owner, under 4, safety, health, nuisance, environmental regulations, there's all of these others. So we added section H, property management, and just saying that short-term rental property shall be managed by a local property manager or owner, which can also be an agent per the definition.
Any comments or questions at the table? Teresa?
Yes, so I love the wording around local. I know I've been in that conversations and you captured it simply. The local property management owner in the definition is spot on, but I think it's more important to state the same down below under regulation that the property owner / manager, whoever it is, the same wording, that they would be within 30 minutes. Yeah, because that's where it's more important than the definition.
Yeah, and I will say I did forget to include, it looks like, and I'll make a note of that, but we did also say that local means within 30 minutes, that someone needs to be able to be there within 30 minutes to take care of any emergencies on the property.
Any more comments or questions at the table? Any comments or questions on the floor? Any comments or questions online? Any disagreement moving it forward? All right, 25.
25, 4.5, section 4.5.27, hill slope stability. We have a hop on over there. So that's page 4.5-2. So we just added the term, it used to just be soils, and we just added and hillside stability to the title. Or hill, yeah. I obviously couldn't read when I was doing these. It's supposed to be hillside, not hill slope. Yeah.
Any comments or questions at the table?
It's not about that in particular, it's actually right underneath that, the Rock Creek floodplain. It still says in there, all development in the 100-year floodplain, and FEMA no longer uses that term. They use the special flood hazard area. Okay. So we might want to update our terminology.
Yeah. Yeah, look into that.
4.5, that's 35, it's right underneath the sign. They quit using 100-year floodplain because people thought they would never flood in 100 years, and that's not true.
When they start counting.
Yeah, so now they say it's a special flood hazard area because it's a certain percent every year that your property can flood.
What are you, an insurance agent?
Any comments from the floor? Any comments or questions online? Any objection to moving it forward?
That's the kind of feedback I like. You read another section and telling me.
Item 26.
Item 26, 4.5.34. Subsidence, which is page 4.5-3. So we just, where it said state lands, we added or another governing agency, as another governing agency might have stricter language for subsidence.
Any comments or questions at the table? Any comments or questions on the floor? Any comments or questions online? Any disagreement with moving it forward? All right, 27.
27 is the next page, section 4.5.41. This is where we get into our parking and loading standards. So we just added to that first paragraph, the purpose and intent of the section is to establish adequate off-street parking standards designed to lessen congestion on streets, but not excessive off-street parking requirements, while remaining compatible with growth policy goals. And so we added that last little bit because anytime we can remind ourselves and others that this is to reflect our growth policy goals, and we make changes to reduce some parking requirements because those are within our growth policy goals.
Any comments or questions at the table? Any comments or questions on the floor? Any comments or questions online? Any objections moving it forward? Okay, 28.
So 28, section 4.5.42, under applicability D, uses not identified, and excess parking. And so I provided the example of the old language in there, and then what it now reads. And that one to me is self-explanatory, so, but if you have questions, you know.
Any questions at the table? I didn't know. Questions at the table, questions on the floor? Questions online? Objections moving it forward? 29.
29, 4.5.42, so similar area, subsection F was added, that whole section was added. And so this is, again, you know, in trying to be following with our growth policy goals to find ways that we can reduce parking requirements, especially for areas that contribute to our active transportation plan and improve walkability within Red Lodge.
Questions or comments at the table? Questions or comments on the floor? Questions or comments online? Anyone have an objection to moving it forward? All right, 30.
30, the big one. So that's our table 4.5.43. That is our required off-street parking table. So this one we looked over quite extensively, but over a couple of meetings to reduce parking requirements. And I know I've kind of referenced this a couple times already, so if anyone has specific questions on the change, let me know, and I can hopefully address it.
One question I have that's just kind of general about the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So for one dwelling, 2 per unit, was there a discussion about, I saw in the ADU description that there'd be a requirement of 1 off-street parking space per ADU, or at least that's how I read it.
In the ADU section?
Yes. And so I'm just wondering if that is allowed to be part of these 2 per unit, or if, since there's technically, if the ADU is not its own dwelling, so just curious how that math works.
And that may have been because we reduced for ADU guest house, we reduced it from 1 to 0. So it just may have been that we just didn't go back and change that language to reflect it, kind of like how we did with the bed and breakfast, where we had to go back and adjust language.
Okay, so I just found language has not been updated. So it is 0.
Thank you.
ADUs do not need ADUs do not need an off-street parking.
Correct.
Thank you. That's very okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa.
Maybe I'm reading it wrong, but golf course reduction from 6 to 4 and 2 to 1, or 1. Those are still 6 and 2. 6 and 2. Okay, you said golf.
Yeah.
And
I don't know why it's on this and on a different one and not on this one.
Any more comments or questions from the table? Any comments or questions on the floor? Any comments online? Any objections to moving it forward? All right, 31.
Okay, hold on a second.
I wrote that down for you too.
Thank you. Okay. 31, section 4.5 that's supposed to be 44, which is, parking, lot design, surfacing and grading. So we did have some discussion, in regards to allowing permeable options and encouraging them through our zoning regulations, so they're not required, but it's again, you know, if someone's reading this and reading the parking requirement, to them that says they would like us to explore permeable options to impermeable options.
Comments or questions at the table? Comments or questions on the floor? Comments or questions online? Any objections? Moving it forward. All right, 32. Water.
Section 4.5.44, same section, subsection 8, so you'll have to flip over through the figures, so it'll be on 4.5-10. So we did a lot of work on our lighting sections, especially trying to create lighting requirements for parking lot illumination, and so we just added that section in there to reference people to the lighting section for those requirements.
Any comments or questions at the table? Comments or questions from the floor? Comments? Yes. Yes. Did I hear something? Okay. Any comments or questions online? Any objections? Moving it forward. 33.
33, 4.5.45, access and curb cuts. It used to say to work with the zoning administrator, and really it should be something that is worked with the public works director. So we just changed those titles.
Comments at the table? Comments or questions from the floor? Comments or questions online? No objections, moving it forward. Number 34.
34, section 4.5.48, this is in regards to shared parking. So we increased those percentages in A, B, A and B, just to require more shared parking to reduce the need for separate large parking areas for different requirements. So shared parking can be between, like if a church and another use that doesn't require parking, you know, when a church would require parking, they could actually share parking rather than them having to create their own lot.
Comments or questions from the table? Comments or questions from the floor? Comments or questions online? Any objection to moving it forward? All right, 35.
So 35, that same section, just section C, for shared parking for uses with different hours of operation, that used to reference to Sunday. I think in thinking of churches are usually on, host events on Sunday, but churches, you know, not everybody worships on Sunday, and so we changed it to weekend to be a little bit more inclusive.
Comments from the table, or questions? Comments or questions from the floor? Comments or questions online? Any objections to moving it forward? All right, 36.
36. So basically the entire 4.5.70 section is brand spanking new. I mean, we did retain some language, but it went from being just a very small area to something that's very substantial for rightfully so, because I think it's a very important issue. And so a lot of hours went into that whole section. And so I encourage you, just, if you haven't already, just to read the whole section. Let us know if there's things that don't make sense or language that seems to contradict. That's a big one.
Any comments or questions at the table? Yes?
I'm wondering if because it's such a new big section, if it would be a good idea to just encourage more conversation versus just moving it forward. Not because I disagree with moving it forward. Just think it might be a good idea for the public to know, like, all the work that you did on this and why it's here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
and who created that section. That was not created by the planning board, so it's very, very, very explicit in areas that even the planning board didn't understand. You'll see that there's lots of terminology and things that you have to be very specific. So I think it's important to note the group that wrote that section, including Northwestern Energy and all of that, it's really involved.
Okay. Would you like more time to read it in full? Because we'll be doing this document a little bit at the next meeting.
And I think this is something too, if somebody sees something, you just like bring it up and I'll look into it, and then we can make sure it's added on to the discussion for the next one. So I didn't try to.
We'll come back to that one then. So no public comments. At this time, we're going to give everybody a chance to study it, and then we'll come back to it at the next meeting. 37.
All I can add is it was dark skies driven, Mrs. Mayor, that this whole section was driven by the dark skies concept.
Thank you, Al. All right, 37.
37 is 4.5.86, and so this looks like a weird one because there is a language that's struck out. This is in regards to sidewalks. Get there. So previously, the city did not have the funding to do sidewalk improvements, and so they didn't want to enforce these standards, but they wanted to keep this in here for the future when we could bring it back. So we're not quite there yet, but we wanted to add some language where in current development, so we recently just had a development that came through the planning board where they don't have existing sidewalks, but there's sidewalks, they would be connecting to it with other sidewalks. And so we added this language to say if a development comes forward to the planning board, we want them to install sidewalks. We don't want people to make them build a sidewalk if there's not going to be any sidewalks, in the next block, or it's just, a floating sidewalk. And so, but if it's continuing those routes, then we want to encourage them to do that. Also, there's been concern over paving in the boulevards, and so paving from the street all the way up to a property line and not leaving that boulevard where we typically have that permeable space, and some people plant trees. And so we don't want to allow that to continue as well while this is marked out.
Comments or questions from the table? Comments or questions from the floor? Any comments or questions online? No objections moving forward?
Can I just ask one question?
Yes.
So, because in a lot of places, like on Platt and over on by my house on Adams, there is no boulevard. It's just sidewalks and the street. So if you don't put like road mix on it or some type of paving, then you get big washboard mud holes. How, when would we put a boulevard in? I mean, is the city planning on putting boulevards in these places, or?
With the stormwater improvements, is making those improvements to the curb gutter and sidewalk is part of the stormwater improvements. But even though I've heard the argument, if you pave it, it's helping with those runouts. But what's happening is that is getting washed to another property, and it's creating erosion on another property. So it's just diverting the problem to somebody else. And so we have, in some of the undeveloped boulevards, I know some people have tried to plant trees or things there to, increase the beauty, I guess, of that area. But, I understand that is a concern, if the city doesn't have an established boulevard there, but we also don't want to increase impermeable services, increase our runoff, which increase costs to the city. So that's kind of the goal behind that education.
Any other comments? Teresa?
Yeah, the boulevard, right? So you really need to have this I mean, it's a greater cost to the city again later to bring it all up when it's time to put down the complete street or to operate on the storm sewer project. So it's best to not do that.
Any objection to moving it forward in the document? Okay, we'll do one more. 38.
Section 4.5.94, so this is under our stormwater management erosion control on page 4.5-25. So 4.94 is stormwater runoff and an erosion control plan. So this language for, at the very end, where it starts with green infrastructure elements that slow runoff, this was added again to encourage people to consider alternatives in their development for green infrastructure. Green infrastructure typically being, but not limited to, like planting trees and shrubs, native grasses to reduce runoff.
Comments or questions from the table?
I just want to say I'm very excited to see this here, given how much money this city spends on stormwater management, and so I'm very delighted and glad we're ending on that.
Any comments or questions from the floor? Any comments or questions online? Any objections to moving it forward? Okay, so with regards to the zoning, next time we're going to do what we can. Marijuana is a special subject because we want to make sure that the zoning regulations are in line with our ordinances. Last time this was done, marijuana was illegal in the state of Montana. We'll do what we can with any issues within the confines of this project and the zoning document. And you can stay tuned to the agenda, and we'll list on there with as much specificity as possible. We'll also come back to the lighting section. So if anybody wants to say, the dark sky project is pretty interesting, and it's actually a pretty informative section beyond telling you what kind of light to buy. But I would like to invite public comment on anything you'd like to talk about that the city can do things for. So, any public comment? Are y'all tired of talking about the
Jen has a North Platte comment on parking, and I sat in on a lot of the planning board meetings, and you guys do a great job. My only comment is that I asked a question at a planning board meeting about commercial parking in residential areas where it's clear that somebody has commercial vehicles parked, taking up a significant section of a block. And it was explained to me at the planning board that the only governing piece of information we have on that is the ordinance that says you have to move a vehicle every so often. Is that right? Did I get that right? So I just want to bring that up, that there are areas in town where that host quite a few commercial vehicles in residential. It doesn't necessarily bother me personally, but when we talk about parking and whether we need off-street or, what do we need for long-term units, et cetera, or short-term rentals, I also want it to just be put out there that there are sections where commercial trucks, dump trucks, et cetera, are parked. And I mean, we're under construction, so we've got some of those parked in front of our place, and they'll move on. But I just wanted to ask that, just put that out there. And we also, as a company, we passed on to our owners that this dark skies information and zoning is coming. So as they make improvements to their property or make changes, that they might want to check in with the zoning or ask us about the lighting, outside lighting in particular.
Thank you. Any more comments on the floor? Al?
Yeah, first, I just wanted to thank Courtney and Sandy and Dave for being there representing the planning board. And I just want to be clear on my notes. We're going to have further discussion on the lighting section and further discussion on the marijuana issue. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay. And is that going to be at the planning board level or at the council level?
I believe it will be at the council level to the extent that we can take care of it at the council level.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you,
Again,
Al.
thank you for your time. This is a lot of stuff to go through, and as you mentioned, the planning board worked very hard on this, but this is a team effort between planning board and council. And again, thanks Sandy and Courtney and Dave for their hard work.
Holly.
And Molly's here.
He turned off the hearing aids.
Anyway,
And I will tell you, the audio is not all that good, so I only got about 2/3 of the conversation, so.
Holly's here too.
And I would also like to make one more announcement. The city has been advertising the position of city planner. And we looked at the applications we received and we promoted Courtney. So Courtney. And she was very thorough and she's very good at what she does. She will be our planning director. And so you can look forward to seeing Courtney even more. And we've also we're contracting with an outside company to supplement our services, which should ultimately wind up in saving the city money. So that is the update from the city end of things. And does anybody have anything else? Well, then we will adjourn the meeting. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Hey, if we get all the